I'll be the first to say that Dark Souls 2 is not the best game made by From Software. It's clunky, it has mechanical issues, and a pretty scuffed PC port, especially when it released. It is relatively easy compared to other Soulsborne games, and comparatively, it is the weakest in almost every way. If you ask someone that plays these games what they think the weakest Souls game is, they will almost always tell you Dark Souls 2. However, there is one quality that I think Dark Souls 2 has other games beat in that I haven't heard others talk about. Something that I noticed from the very first time I started playing the game that stayed with me all the way to now, 8 years later. Something that every game has, but something that Dark Souls 2 excels at. And if you read the title of the video, then you're probably going to know what I'm going to say, but it is the atmosphere of Dark Souls 2. There's no other way I could put it. Dark Souls 2 is incredibly atmospheric, and it leans into this style in almost every way it can. From the art style, to the music, and the NPCs that are scattered throughout. The way this game feels is what propels it higher than I think most people give it credit for. That's not to say that other Souls games have a bad atmosphere, as games like Bloodborne and Sekiro feel very atmospheric to play as well. It's just that Dark Souls 2 is so heavily criticized, so much so that I often don't see people give it credit where credit is due. So let me try and explain to you what I mean. I first played Dark Souls 2 in 2015, and it was the first Dark Souls game that I ever played. Does this make me biased, as well as open up the door to nostalgia? Yes, it does. But I think I can separate my feelings from the analysis. Dark Souls 2 has a lot of problems that I do want to go over, as you can't mention only the good without giving credit to the valid criticisms about this game. So this first part of this video will be me addressing some of the problems I have with Dark Souls 2. Partly because I believe if you really love something, you can be critical of it as a way to show your passion, but also as a way to show you that I am not drowning in nostalgia from having first played it 8 years ago. Probably the biggest issue that I have with this game is its decisions on enemy placement and enemy quantity. Dark Souls 2 is littered with unnecessary enemies in a way that makes it feel like more of an artificial difficulty increase, instead of careful planned out design for player enjoyment. Of course, adding more enemies does make the game more difficult, however, it doesn't always result in a more enjoyable experience. After completing Dark Souls 2 once, I was excited to start New Game Plus to try and test my skills and see my growth. However, upon going into New Game Plus, I was met with the reality that there was just more enemies, many times appearing in the form of red phantoms that seemed strewn about haphazardly. The Lost Center boss fight was one of my favorites in my first playthrough. I liked the arena, I liked the boss design, I liked the implications behind the fight and the excitement that came with killing an old one. The fight was purely exhilarating, with an insatiable grittiness comboed with freakish sounding music that almost mimicked the erratic movements of the Lost Center. So as you may assume, when I got to him in New Game Plus, I was thoroughly excited to fight him again and to see my growth from the last time I fought him. However, I was disappointed to see the exact same boss, just with 2 extra mobs now, which just created a nuisance instead of making the boss fight more challenging and fun. This philosophy is present throughout the entire game, from the very first area you step foot in. You don't even have to go into New Game Plus to experience it. I understand the idea behind game designs, as almost every game will include mini enemies in between you and your objective, as a way to try and keep you busy and to pad the game with more content. This is not bad at all, as I wouldn't want every game to just be a boss rush, and in some cases, game developers can use enemy placement coupled with level designs to potentially enhance the experience, such as telling a story. However, Dark Souls 2's enemy placement almost has no sense to it, and Scholar of the First Sin did not help very much in this regard. Upon multiple playthroughs though, it starts to make a little more sense why they decided to go with this design philosophy. Dark Souls 2 was my first Souls game like I mentioned earlier, which inevitably meant that it was going to be extremely hard for me, but after playing through all of the other games a multitude of times, it is clear that Dark Souls 2 is extremely easy relative to those games. The excess of enemies in Dark Souls 2 is probably a last-ditch effort to try and make the game more difficult. The fact that Dark Souls 2 had a rushed development cycle probably validates this, which is definitely unfortunate and not always the fault of the game developer, but entering a boss room with a bunch of little rats that toxic you within 2 hits, only to have a giant rat summon within the next 10 seconds, is one of the worst boss experiences out of all the Souls games. And yes, that fight pisses me off so much. Speaking of boss experiences, I also can't deny that Dark Souls 2 is lacking in the boss category. Bosses tend to be one of the major highlights about From Software games. From Software has been successful at making meaningful encounters that are fun for the player and visually appealing while still being extremely challenging. This is even more evident in their recent titles, with the advantage of having new technology to allow for more unique boss designs and mechanics. Which, if you want an example of their newer boss design, then just look at Elden Ring. There's tons of bosses in there that have amazing mechanics and they're extremely varied in their designs. Dark Souls 2, for the most part, is not their best work in terms of boss design. Prior to Elden Ring, Dark Souls 2 had the most bosses of any Souls game to date, which many like to cite as the quality over quantity argument. 42 total bosses, including DLC. Comparatively, Sekiro had 17 bosses, and there's not a single boss that I would call bad in that game. The same can't be said for Dark Souls 2, however. A few reused bosses, and a ton of bosses that felt uninspired. The first boss you are most likely to encounter is the Last Giant. To be fair, the cutscene for this fight is actually really cool. I don't know what it is about it, but it inspires fear every time I see it. To then be met with this. An ankle slapper with extremely slow stomps and melee attacks that he doesn't even use since you spend most of your time at his feet. It just feels like for this boss specifically, there just could have been more. It's a cool design in a cool arena, I just wish they would have executed it better. Admittedly, the Pursuer is also an extremely cool boss in theory. Very cool design, a visually stunning arena, with a way to take down the Pursuer extremely quickly if you're skilled enough. However, in practice, this fight can boil down to roll, smack smack, roll, smack smack. I even ended up killing him in the earlier arena because I wanted to test myself and see if I could, because he doesn't actually respawn here if you die to him. You have to go up to his actual arena, which arguably makes the fight even easier as he doesn't have a phase 2 and the space is extremely open. You can just bait out his charge attack and then roll to the side and hit him once or twice. But seeing this big hulk of armor with such a cool cutscene before it with red glowing eyes and a sword the length of a car, it is a letdown seeing how substantially easy he is, with most of the times he hit me being because of low adaptability stats. Of course, there is nothing wrong with an easy boss in a game. Games that are easy can still be fun, but in the context of Dark Souls games, being comparatively easy to the other games in the catalog will set you apart in a way that isn't favorable with the community. And to be fair, some of the bosses in Dark Souls 2 are creative in design, such as Executioner's Chariot, Looking Glass Knight, Demon of Song, and Sir Alone, just to name a few. And there's definitely not as much reuse of bosses as there was in Elden Ring, but a good portion of the encounters in Dark Souls 2 feel disappointing, even when met with how imposing the boss may look upon first glance. Up until now though, it may seem like I am just ripping on the quality of Dark Souls 2, and to some degree I am. There were a lot of improvements that could have been made in Dark Souls 2, and while some improvements were made in Scholar of the First Sin, Dark Souls 2 is still definitely near the bottom of the pack in terms of mechanics and consistency. But from the first time I set foot into Drang Lake to now, there is one hill that I will die on that I don't see getting talked about enough. Something I cite to people whenever I get into a debate about the quality of Dark Souls 2, and something that is rather abstract to talk about, so bear with me in my attempts to explain it. That is the atmosphere of Dark Souls 2. I will never forget the feeling of walking into Majula for the first time, the sunlight cresting through the cave entrance, the stroll you take down to the main bonfire as the music settles in around you. The Majula OST has to be one of my favorite OSTs from any Souls game ever. It is so calming, the instruments are so delicate, yet you can't help but catch notes of dissonance that promote a potential eeriness within the world. Majula itself has to be one of the best starting areas. So many undertones of sorrow and despair. The people you meet there all seem broken in a way. They all have the character traits that set them apart from any normal NPC. The Emerald Herald tells a story about the king and implores you to go and gather souls of the old ones, a quest that many undead have attempted and failed.
Are you the next monarch, or merely a pawn of fate, bearer of the curse? I will remain by your side till this frail hope shatters. Take this with you. May it ease your journey. Go on and see the king. He who made Drangleic what it once was. He who peered at the essence of the soul. King Vendrick.
The blacksmith and the merchant are both simple in nature, with the merchant specifically piquing my interest. He's so timid, and it almost makes you wonder why there's some random merchant present in Majula selling these things anyways. Of course, I am sure that many fans of Dark Souls 2 also know that the more money you spend with him, the cockier he becomes, which is a bit of a comedic addition. However, my favorite NPC present in Majula has to be the crestfallen warrior, sitting atop the stairs near the shrine. When I think of an NPC that perfectly encapsulates the Dark Souls 2 atmosphere, it is this guy.
You're undead, aren't you? You have that distinct scent, the smell of irreversible fate. I am Solden. And like you, I lost everything. And now I'm here. You probably heard that it was possible to break the curse here. Well, that's not true at all. There's nothing here for you, me, or anybody. Do you know much about souls? Even I'm not certain, but I'm told that the soul is the essence of life itself. Anything living, sentient or no, supposedly has one. What we call the curse is traceable to the soul. Do you see what that means? To be alive, to walk this earth. That's the real curse, right there. We undead will never die. And that's quite a predicament, really.
He has given up on the quest that is laid out before the player. He is a broken man that has succumbed to the fate of being undead. You can't help but feel sorry for him, and even with being broken, he still offers you some words of advice, just like many of the others that you will encounter throughout this game. I never really gave it much thought, but this is unironically one of my favorite NPCs in any video game ever. He is perfectly crafted to fit the tone of this game, and Majula is the perfect place to find him, with it being the safe haven of sorts. However, what drives home the words that he utters to you is the fact that there is a plaque right next to him that keeps track of the amount of player deaths that have occurred in Dark Souls 2. However, it is debated whether or not this is based on just your chosen console or over all of the consoles Dark Souls 2 came on. You also have to keep in mind that it probably doesn't take into account deaths in offline mode, so the actual number may be much higher. Even years after the release of the game, Majula is still a sight to behold. The culmination of the music, the NPCs, the color palette, the perceived location, it really makes Majula a special place in my eyes, and even still, a touch of uneasiness remains in this oasis. And I think this persists through the whole game. The color palette specifically is the most varied in Dark Souls 2. Every other Souls game has a pretty strict color palette that they don't often stray from. One example people often like to bring up is Dark Souls 3. It is full of muddy browns and grays, so much so that the areas don't distinguish themselves in terms of theme really, besides a few exceptions of course. Dark Souls 2 has some extremely beautiful areas that are all pretty unforgettable, and even with this large variety, the art direction still draws similarities between each area, So it doesn't feel like they aren't all part of the same game, if you know what I mean. I can't help but look at areas like Shrine of Amana and find it anything less than amazing, even if this area mechanically is a headache for many players, including myself. On the flip side, you also have a place like Iron Keep. It feels evil and significant, like an extremely imposing foe is waiting for you at the end. Which there technically is one, but he is just imposing by looks alone, to be fair. Also, we can just gloss over the way you get into Iron Keep, because I don't know if anyone's able to explain that. Other notable areas include places like Frozen Elium Lois, the DLC Snow Castle, which looks breathtaking and has an amazing scale to it, as well as Dragon Eyrie, an entire civilization of dragons suspended high in the sky, with an almighty dragon waiting for you at the end. That is more or less a trivial fight to beat. However, probably my favorite area in Dark Souls 2 has to be the Broom Tower. Crossing the giant chain while looking out over the vast burning fields below, being suspended far above, my vertigo was definitely kicking in at this point. The design of this area just feels ever so grand. It raises so many questions in my mind. Many times in Souls games, you are placed in a time period that tends to be after big events that take place in the story. You are often presented with the aftermath, and in some cases it is your duty to try and fix it. This is one of those situations where I just have to sit and wonder what exactly is going on here, what happened, and what is the story behind this area. Why is the ground set ablaze for as far as the eye can see? Why am I suspended so far above? What was the purpose of this tower? And who needs a chain that's this fucking big? Like, seriously. But I digress. Dark Souls 2 never shied away from scale, like many of the Souls games. There are so many large things, or vast scenes to bask in the glory of. And it's like I mentioned earlier, all of these surreal scenes that Dark Souls 2 portrays raise questions as to what this world was like years in the past. I think the concept of years in the past is something that lends itself to the atmosphere of the game very well, in fact. A good portion of the things I've mentioned prior, specifically about the NPCs, have been rooted in a sorrow about the world they find themselves in. So what exactly is this world that we find ourselves in? Drangleic is the name of the land, and you are an undead, someone who is cursed with the ability to live through unending deaths. However, the more deaths you endure, the more you become hollow. Hollows are undead that have completely lost their souls, that wander the world without purpose. Already this basis for a story is intriguing. It creates a lingering feeling of despair in the form of going hollow, and the game tells you this as a way for it to warn you of what lies ahead. Side note, I think I heard somewhere a while ago that the original concept was for you to go, if you went fully hollow, then, I don't know, something along the lines of like a complete deletion of your save state. I'm sure that's way more extreme than the idea originally was, but now the max amount of hollow you can go is just half your health bar, so I don't know. It would have been interesting to see that be fleshed out a little more, you know, like them leaning into the idea of going hollow, but it probably would have been way too extreme for many people, including myself. But back to what I was saying. Your journey is to gain power through the souls of the old ones, so that you may one day stand before King Vendrick in hopes of breaking the curse, whether that be by bringing on an age of light with the reignition of the flame, or by smothering the flame, bringing on an age of dark, or by bringing on something else entirely. This nuance with the ending of the game plays perfectly into the character of the game itself. Often people like to say that with all Souls games, it is very easy to beat these games without really knowing anything about the story or why you're slaughtering boss after boss. Dark Souls 2's story plays into this in a way, with some NPCs expressing that you may not actually know why you're going through this journey, other than that it is the fate of an undead like yourself.
This ring is the symbol of the king. Use it to gain passage through the king's gate and venture to the far east. Bearer of the curse. If you are to be the next monarch, then one day you will walk those grounds without really knowing why.
This constant reaffirmment of the world you inhabit being veiled in despair, along with all of my previous statements, may have you wondering, why would I want to play a game that is so full of anguish? Well, that's the thing. That is the intended feeling for this game. The culmination of the art style, the music, the NPCs, the level design, everything is crafted to create an experience where you can feel like you are in this world. You don't feel like a third party playing this game. You get a taste for what Drangleic is actually like. You feel bad for the people that inhabit it. You get lost in the world around you, and it is only in brief periods where you can stop and reflect on the beautiful parts of this world, clouded in hopelessness. I found it extremely hard to try and describe what I mean when I talk about the atmosphere of Dark Souls 2, which would make sense. Atmosphere in video games is a concept that is reinforced by things that I've mentioned previously, like sound design and art style, which are not easily explained any further than me calling them excellent and then providing examples. So I hope I was able to capture the ideas to some degree, but of course, you can never fully understand the exact feeling something creates without diving into it yourself. So if you haven't played Dark Souls 2 in a long time, I recommend you give it another go. And if you've never tried Dark Souls 2, then go into it with an open mind. People like to shit on it for its shortcomings, but I think it deserves more credit. So when you're progressing through it, whether an old or new player, try your best to stop every once in a while and enjoy the atmosphere. Thanks for watching.